Sir, live.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're dialing in from. A pleasure to be here today and to be with a fantastic group of panelists who we're about to hear from. We're delighted to be collaborating with Duke Law School and of course, OP Jindal Global University and the Centre for Sports Law, Business and Governance is delighted to welcome our guest speaker today, Professor Paul Hagen, who will be speaking on the topic of challenges to the criteria for inclusion and exclusion of competitors in sports. Before we invite Professor Hagen to speak on this very interesting topic, I'll invite the founding Vice Chancellor of OP Jindal Global University, Professor C. Raj Kumar, who, of course, to many of our listeners, does not need an introduction, but Professor Raj Kumar is, of course, a Rhodes Scholar, has graduated from Oxford, Harvard, Hong Kong University, and is the founder of what has become India's the highest ranked law school, certainly. And we're delighted to be exploring a fantastic collaboration with Duke Law School. And hopefully this is the first of many such lectures. And on that note, I invite Professor Raj to say a few words in his welcome address.
Thank you very much, Sean. And first of all, I would like to extend a warm welcome to Professor Paul Hagen, Professor and Co-Director of the Center for Sports Law and Policy of Duke University Law School. I'm also grateful to my very dear friend, Suhail Nathani, and of course, colleague Oleg Koblev and others at Duke Law School for helping us put together this event. I'm very delighted that we are hosting this event in collaboration with the Center for Sports Law, Business and Governance at OP Jindal Global University, headed by Professor Sean Starr. And I'm also very delighted that my very distinguished colleague, Professor Sanjeev Pisani, has also joined us here. We are all obviously waiting to listen to the distinguished public lecture on a very important theme that I suppose will resonate with people around the world. Challenges in the criteria for inclusion and exclusion of competitors in sports, something that Professor Paul Hagen's lecture is going to throw light on. But what I thought I will do very briefly is to give a larger context to what we are trying to do within the university and the law school. OP Jindal Global University is a multidisciplinary university with 12 different schools. And our law school is the first school that we established. And now the law school has become one of the leading law schools in Asia, but clearly the most impactful law school in the South Asian region in India, where we are located. The law school has over 4,000 students, has undergraduate, postgraduate, masters and PhD programs. And also we have over 35 research centers and nearly 500 full-time faculty members constitute the law school itself. And one of the things that we have tried to do within the law school is to develop a strong research culture and also capacity building initiatives, including the kind of center that Sean is heading, known as the Center for Sports Law, Business and Governance. We all know that this entire area is an emerging area, at least in the Indian context, and there is so much of interest, including interest among students, to look at issues surrounding law, business and governance within the larger context of sports itself. As we have seen how the kind of challenges of governing sports has, in the last, I would say, a decade or so, there has been a complete transformation of the sports governance aspects of India. Hitherto, the type of interest that we have seen that transcends the state, and the governmental initiatives has never been the case before. Historically, sports like education and many other areas was largely led by the state mechanisms, including the government initiatives. But today, the kind of impact and influence that private initiatives in the field of sports has demonstrated not only in cricket, which dominates in the Indian discourse, but also in many other sporting leagues, only underscores the point that we need to look at issues surrounding law, business, and governance within the field of sports. Today, as India is poised to play a leading role in the world, not just looking at India, but also around the world, it is only important that we prepare our students and also develop research capacities and also develop greater understanding with regard to issues that are going to confront the future of sports. And that also means that we expose the students to new areas and ideas in these fields. I'm personally very delighted that we are collaborating with the Duke Law School. I am familiar with the extraordinary reputation of the Duke University and indeed its law school. The fact that a very distinguished alumni of Duke Law School, Suhail Rathani, has helped us bring together these two institutions. I am confident that what we are embarking on today is going to lead to many more partnerships, including student mobility, areas of research in which faculty members can collaborate, but also other aspects in which we can develop institutional initiatives. So with those words, I want to once again welcome all of you, and in particular, Professor Paul Hagen, Professor and Co-Director of the Center for Sports Law and Policy, to this lecture. I'm also very pleased to see that Professor Hagen was himself a Rhodes Scholar, and I'm sure we will offline talk about some of the experiences that he might have had, at Oxford. And of course, I see that he spent good time at Yale, and there are very interesting, friends and partners who have helped us in our own institutional journey, particularly Professor Peter Schuck of Yale Law School, who continues to chair our International Board of Advisors and also a member of the governing body of our university. So I'm sure we will have many more things to talk offline. But now I want to stop and once again welcome everybody to this distinguished public lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rajkumar, for those introductory remarks. As always, a fantastic welcome address. And I too echo your comments to welcome our colleagues and friends from Duke Law School, Dr. Sani, who's here presiding over our lecture today, Simran, who will deliver our vote of thanks a little bit later as well, and of course our next speaker, who I'll introduce, which is Suhail Rathani, who Professor Raj already mentioned. And Suhail, we were talking about in the beginning phase of this lecture before we went live, is a graduate from Cambridge, and he's a little bit outnumbered amongst some Oxford graduates here today, but we certainly won't hold that against you, Suhail. And but of course, most notably, you also have your LLM from Duke Law School, and that's and we thank you for bringing our two law schools together. You are, of course, also an honorary adjunct professor at OP Jindal Global University. So your worlds are certainly colliding here, and it's fantastic to have you here to give your opening remarks. And I should also mention, of course, your illustrious legal career within India and internationally as a renowned lawyer, both as managing partner of economic law practice, but even generally as a renowned lawyer of international trade law, competition law, and M&A law as well. So your reputation certainly precedes you, and we look forward to hearing your introductory address, and then that will be followed by our distinguished public lecture by Professor Paul Hagen. So over to you, Suhail.
Thank you, Sean. Surrounded by Oxford men, I'm sure I'm going to try and do my best to hold my own over here. I am delighted to be here to introduce Professor Paul Hagen. I was a proud student at Duke University many decades ago, and our time did overlap. Of course, I spent only there because I did an LLM and did my bar exam and moved out pretty quickly. Not enough time, but I've kept in touch with the Duke Law School over the years. I'm also particularly delighted to be hosting this event with Jindal, because I have been an early believer in the vision that Professor Rajkumar brought to India. And the first time he invited me to speak, I think there was only one building ready. And since then, I haven't left. I sent my son to the law school. I keep visiting every time he calls me. And I'm delighted to be here with bright young minds, as I know many Jindal students to be. I will, of course, introduce Professor Hagen in due course, and many of you have already read his credentials, so that will be a brief but pleasant task. But what I do want to talk to you about is Duke Law School, because many students choose to go for LLMs, and I get asked many questions as to where I would recommend people go. Let me tell you that I always put Duke very high up on that list. I have some great memories in North Carolina, in Durham. More than that, it is a fantastic law school. It's a small law school. And what I really liked about my Duke experience is that we took the same classes as the JD students took. So there was, other than one class on legal writing, we are part of the same cohort that goes through all the usual courses, evidence, corporate law, competition law, and we are sitting side by side with the JD students and having the same experience. Of course, an international experience is also delightful, but the difference of being with students who are going to live and practice in the US for sure is a completely different ballgame. I made some great friends. We're in touch with several of them around the world. And I'll give you a short story which summarizes Duke for me. There was a German lawyer, myself, and another hotshot lawyer who came off Wall Street, and we took a securities class together. And we had a student from Taiwan who wanted to join our batch, and all that we could do was grudgingly agree to have her on because we thought we were the hottest short lawyers in those days. And we used to work over weekends and nights on problems, and she would come up with unique ideas, to say the least. And we'd all joke with her and say, Amy, when you become chairman of the Taiwanese securities regulation, you can try that theory. And we all had great time over there while we discussed these problems. Fast forward many years later, not one of us in that batch became a securities lawyer, but Amy did join the Taiwanese Securities Commission and is still a very dear friend of ours. We still have reunions around Duke in that same batch. So it's really great friendships, great memories, and a great law school tucked away in part of the US, which is a 4,000-acre forest campus, and you have a great time both learning and enjoying nature. So anybody who looks for an LLM, I would strongly urge you to consider Duke, not only for the reasons I told you, but for the high caliber of the faculty that you will get to see in a few minutes. Professor Paul Hagen was there when I was there. I never had the good fortune of taking a class with him, but of course he has been at every notable university in the world, starting from Haverford, Princeton, Yale, Oxford, and has dedicated his time to teaching at several universities. He has, of course, been at Duke the longest, but has spent time in Austria, spent time in Germany. And I can tell you this, that professors at Duke University do a lot of industry interaction as well. And they're all the better for that. And it enriches the student community that much more. So without much ado, I am going to leave the screen and allow Professor Hagen to take over and address us on this very exciting and rising area of the law. Thank you once again, Professor Rajkumar, Dr. Sani, Sean, and everybody else who supported this at Jindal. And hopefully I'll get a chance to visit you in person soon. Over to you, Professor Hagen.
Well, I want to start, first of all, by assuring the Cambridge folks that I actually taught there. So you don't need to feel totally left out.
Thank you.
I want to thank the Jindal Global Law School and the Center for Sports Law, Business, and Governance for giving me this opportunity to speak to you today. What you have accomplished at Jindal in the short time since your founding is nothing short of amazing. It is a privilege to be associated with this level of dynamism, even if only virtually and at many removes. It is, I think, particularly appropriate to talk to this audience about sport and by implication, India's eventual role. India is, of course, the first country outside the West to take over the dominant role in a major sport, in cricket. So India now is the most important player in the governance of cricket. And it is the first, and I'm sure not the last, sport where the center has shifted from the West to Asia. Now, what I'm going to do today is to try to lay out some of what I think has been happening, and as Professor Kumar correctly said, in a situation in which sport governance is increasingly contested. So just with a couple of starting points. Sport is controlled competition. It proceeds in accordance with rules that are either organically accepted culturally or developed by the governing entities that control sport. It also happens in real time. The rules that govern sport need to be enforceable in ways that permit competition to proceed without excessive delay or cost. Now, rule changes, or conversely, refusals to change, are important reflections on the place of sport in the relevant society. Should sport celebrate tradition? How should sport respond to technological change and possibility? How should sport respond to changes in societal normative understandings and priorities? The ways in which these questions get answered have the potential profoundly to change competition and equally profoundly to impact the social role of sport in society. To use an accessible example of change, the sport of pole vaulting in its current form was built around the acceptance of technological innovation. The poles, originally hardwood, then bamboo, metal, fiberglass, and now carbon fiber, have resulted in dramatic increases in the heights that pole vaulters can clear, and also in the skills, and that thus the athletes likely to succeed. Such changes in competition rules can and have resulted in challenges within governing structures of the sport itself. What exactly is the sport? How should it be defined? Because such governing structures exist within the broader structure of domestic and international law, whenever they involve changes in access to substantial rewards or implicate important political values, they will be challenged according to those laws. Again, at a sort of trivial level, but I think something that indicates the space in which this can happen. An attempt by the commissioner of the National Basketball Association to introduce balls made from synthetic materials in place of the leather balls then currently used in competition was met with widespread revolt from the players. They threatened to file grievances under the collective bargaining agreement and asserted that the introduction of new balls constituted a change in the terms and conditions of work, and thus could not be introduced unilaterally and had to be bargained collectively. Rather than bargaining collectively, the commissioner backed down. When U-groove golf club faces were developed to rival the traditional V-groove club faces, they threatened the painstakingly acquired skill advantages of the best golfers. Those established golfers succeeded in getting the Professional Golfers Association in the United States to ban U-groove clubs in competition. That decision opposing innovation was then challenged on the ground that it constituted a conspiracy and restraint of trade among competitors to reduce competition in the marketplace for golf clubs. What I will be talking about for the remainder of my remarks today is not such simple equipment rules and their real or imagined distributional effects, but rather eligibility criteria related to participation in sport and their undoubted distributional effects. What I will attempt to do is describe and identify what these criteria do and the circumstances under which they are most likely to provoke legal challenges, and then the form of rules that are most likely to survive those challenges. The challenges to eligibility rules increasingly are grounded in the claim that they are insufficiently inclusive or that they fail to achieve competitions that are fair. Now, sports are generally organized in one of two ways: as open competitions, open or universal competitions, or as category competitions. Open or universal competitions treat as eligible to compete anyone, or in conditions of scarcity, anyone who meets certain sport performance criteria, the right to compete. These open competitions award whatever prizes or laurels are associated with the competition to those who win. They are formally inclusive, and the question presented is whether they're fair. Now, it is in the nature of sport competition that it has the effect of favoring some persons and disfavoring others. Those who succeed are necessarily at the extreme end of some human continuum, and they tend to have certain body types. As we meet here today in the Winter Olympics currently taking place in China, all of the ski jumpers will be tall, thin, and have low BMI. The university where I teach, here at Duke, all but one of the starters on the men's basketball team are in the top 1% of height of males of the relevant age in the United States. The more elite the competition, the more exaggerated the selection effect. One study, and I confess I'm not entirely sure I vouch for its validity, but I'll use it for the purpose as an example, concluded that at the highest level of the sport of basketball, the National Basketball Association, teams include 17% of all the men in the world between the ages of 20 and 40 who are taller than 7 feet. But only an infinitesimal percentage of those under 6'6". Other open competitions in sport frequently produce similar, if perhaps less immediately obvious results. So Anatole France famously observed The law in its majestic equality forbids all men to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal bread, the rich as well as the poor. By analogy, open competitions in most sports create a majestic equality that automatically excludes most of mankind. So, in the space of open competition, challenges relate to the distributive effect of this majestic equality, or more precisely, to the use of aids, chemical and physical, designed to permit those not so favored by the lottery of life to get in the game. The World Anti-Doping Code bans the use of substances or methods that meet 2 of 3 criteria. They are performance enhancing, injurious to health, or in this wonderful and ambiguous phrase, contrary to the spirit of sport. It is not immediately obvious why such doping should be disallowed in sport. They are not disallowed in many non-sporting competitions. So in one of the critical piano performance competitions in the world, the Van Cliburn competition, it was discovered that every one of the competitors was using a substance that was banned in sport. Most common explanation is that doping, if not banned, forces athletes into a Faustian bargain in which their choices are to lose or to dope. But sport, at least at the elite level, involves many such bargains. No one who watches Olympic skiers careening down icy slopes at 90 miles per hour can possibly believe that sport is not likely eventually to be injurious to health. Sport takes bodies to extremes. By removing the possibility of doping, these rules take away the bargain and ensure that those athletes who would otherwise be tempted to accept the consequences of doping instead have to accept losing. If not immediately obvious why doping should be banned, it is beyond cavil that it is. The campaign against doping constitutes the most successful moral campaign in sport in the last century, one that is now enforced by an extensive international non-governmental bureaucracy, and in some countries like the United States, by the power of criminal law and the threat of criminal prosecution. The anti-doping effort relies on increasingly sophisticated methods of detecting analytical positives, but also critically, and what will become a theme today, is in shifting burdens of proof. Sport regulators regularly lost the early doping cases because even when they could find evidence of a doping substance in the body of a competitor, they could not establish how it got there. The regulatory response has been to treat doping as a strict liability offense. The substance is there, the athlete is ineligible to compete. Since increasingly the doping substances that are used to gain advantages in competition are ones that occur naturally in the body, the burdens have further shifted to permit the anti-doping authorities to ban athletes based on inferences or failures to cooperate in testing. The usual burdens in enforcement actions no longer apply. As I have written elsewhere, the players have lost that argument. Instead, much of the action in this area is now focused on balancing legitimate medical uses of substances that have performance-enhancing effects, that is, the therapeutic use exceptions. The second of the challenges relates to the accommodation of disabilities. The case of Casey Martin, an American golfer, is essentially a question: who gets to decide what a sport is, or more precisely, how consistent do a sporting body's rules need to be if the impact of those rules would be to deny a competitor the opportunity to compete? Martin had a neurodegenerative disease that he believed, and had medical evidence, would make it impossible for him to walk the entire golf course. He was allowed to try, but refused on the ground that it would be pointless. He sued, claiming that he had a right to be accommodated or in his disability, and that because in some of its competitions, the golfing authorities had allowed older competitors to use golf carts or other kinds of aids, it was impermissible to ban his use. And he won. The next case I want to touch on is a case that in its initial iteration I was marginally involved in, and that's the case of Oscar Pistorius. His case involved a slightly different question, not the rules of the sport, but whether the use of a prosthetic device, purpose-built carbon fiber blades, constituted an unfair advantage in competition. The hastily draft should take a short background comment. Pistorius had been incredibly successful in local competitions in South Africa, despite the fact that he had had his legs amputated at the knee before he was 1 year old. He was recovering in something that I can't explain to you from an injury when he had been playing rugby. How you play rugby on prosthetic legs, I don't know, but took up running as a way to get back in the competition, turned out to be extraordinarily good and uniquely good as a double amputee. This was exciting to the IAAF because it created a lot of interest in the competitions. They invited him to participate, and then worryingly to the IAAF, he finished second in a major international competition. The organization then hastily drafted rules designed to prevent him from continuing to compete. The rules, however, place the burden of proof on the organization that Pistorius gained an advantage over another runner by running on prosthetics. Now, this turned out to be an absolutely impossible burden to meet. because it was difficult, first of all, to understand what another runner was. If he gained an advantage over me, that would ensure he won no international competitions. So the baseline was essentially the determination of whether someone running on prosthetics could actually be considered someone who could win. But the other problem, the IAAF, as I said, put the burden on itself to prove that these prosthetics gave Pistorius an unfair advantage. That burden they couldn't meet, and they lost in the Court of Arbitration for Sport. Now, shortly after they lost, he competed in the Paralympics and was beaten by a Brazilian runner running on prosthetics. And he got extremely angry and went to the press and said that the other runner was actually gaining an unfair advantage because his prosthetics were too long. That he was essentially turning himself into some sort of kangaroo or giraffe or something like that. His objections were met with derision in much of the world press, but they in fact were clearly correct. A prosthetic could be something that would entirely change the competition. So, for example, if rather than prosthetic carbon fiber blades, he were driving in a sports car, it would change the competition. The IAAF responded to its loss by this theme that I've been hitting on. They changed the burden of proof. They required the athlete to demonstrate that they weren't gaining an advantage, and they required the athlete to pre-approve any prosthetic before attempting to use it in competition. Those burdens of proof, no double amputee has ever been able to meet. Now, categorical competitions are based on the idea that it is fairer to limit competition in certain ways by excluding some potential competitors. In an earlier era, the goal of these categorical eligibility rules was often to reinforce certain social hierarchies, or at least ensure that the sport did not become the sort of unsettling solvent that might undermine them. So, sport eligibility was limited to those who could afford to compete without getting paid for their participation. So I've seen cricket bats in the background here. This included creating different entries onto the hallowed grounds at Lord's for gentlemen and players, players being those who needed to be paid. And so what you get is sport eligibility limited to those who could afford to compete without getting paid for their participation, or to gentlemen, or merely to men, because allowing women to compete was thought to be inconsistent with their appropriate role in the society. These social goals of the 19th and 20th century are now anathema in the 21st. The charters and competition rules of most sporting bodies, including the IOC, the various international and national federations, and domestic sports governing bodies like the NCAA in the United States, now insist that eligibility rules, which by their nature exclude, have to be designed to promote inclusion. This apparent contradiction can be explained as a response to the selection bias in open or universal competitions. The effect of these categories is then to reproduce those same selection biases, but in smaller pools of participants. Such competitions are understood to be fairer in that they lessen the outsized impact of some particular aspect of the competition by limiting competitors to certain weight or age or institutional, regional, or national affiliation, or increasingly controversially, sex. They seek to protect the eligible class from competition from those outside the class. Now, all of these categorical limitations, or at least the ones that have been accepted and stable, rely on rough rules of thumb. Weight roughly correlates with strength. Chronological age roughly correlates with size and muscle development. I think that no serious person would believe that it's possible to establish with any degree of certainty or precision exactly what role weight or age plays in creating advantages or disadvantages for certain competitors, but there is a broad sense that it does. They also rely on characteristics that are relatively easily established and measured. Scales are ubiquitous, generally accurate enough, relatively cheap, and produce instant results. Establishing chronological age is obviously harder, more susceptible of frauds, and particularly problematic in societies without good record keeping. But in the grand scheme of things, neither are too expensive or too unreliable to prove. The ones that are not stable and are subject to difficult challenges are those in which the category itself has critical and contested social meaning, or the reason for the creation of the category is complicated. Sex is such a category. So the origin of the special sex categories, there are really two underlying rationales for the creation of the sex categories in sport. The first is that women were initially simply excluded from participation. The category was that category of persons not allowed to compete. That exclusion was grounded, as I've already noted, in the idea that it was unseemly or contrary to women's roles. Once women were allowed to compete in sports, the category, like age or weight, was designed then additionally to protect them from competition from men, so that they could be successful within their category and included in sport. Now, within the creation of the category, some competitors were challenged that they should be excluded on the ground that they were not really women. Beginning with the 1936 Olympics, track and field was faced with the difficulty of deciding which competitors properly belonged in the category and which did not. In 1936, that involved simply a visual inspection of genitalia, external genitalia. But over time, that shifted to consideration of the X and Y chromosome, elaborate panel determinations of which category someone should be put in, and most recently, limited requirements that the persons wishing to compete in the category fall into certain testosterone secreting levels. Now, when we were dealing, as I said earlier, with categories like weight, those categories don't carry the kind of deep social meaning or identity characteristics that sex does. So when I competed as a wrestler, I did identify as a 120-pounder. I thought of myself in that category, but that didn't involve other parts of my life. The category of whether you are treated as a woman or not obviously has extraordinarily more significant effects on identities and self-understanding. India, of course, was critically involved, or the Indian Track and Field Federation was critically involved in one of the most important cases trying to determine who could compete or not compete as a woman. This is the Duty Chand case in the Court of Arbitration for Sport. That particular case raised for international sport the following issue. How do we understand exactly what it means to be in one category or another? When Chand was prevented from competing as a woman, she had nowhere else to compete because she quite clearly wasn't a man. So the decision to treat her as not eligible to compete was the decision, as a woman, was the decision not to compete at all. The response of sport uniformly since the Chand case has been to shift the understanding of what the sex categories are to a protected class, women, a class in which men cannot compete, and an open class, so that any person who is not able to compete as a woman, as deemed ineligible, can compete in this other open class. Of course, part of the problem here is the labeling. Why is it that we are calling them men's competition and women's competition? Shouldn't we, if the category that is distinguishing those who are eligible or not eligible, being levels of testosterone secretion, simply call that. So you would turn on the Olympics or go to the Indian National Championships, and they would announce the low secreting testosterone competition and the high secreting testosterone competition. I think what this is exposing is another issue in sport. It has to have some kind of social or cultural relevance and resonance in order to develop the support for the activity. All right, so now we are faced with how do we deal with a characteristic that has important cultural salience, but is defined in ways that are actually technical and unlike the ways in which most of the society define the term. This is a space in which there is extraordinary uncertainty about the direction. So the first person to challenge it after Chand was Caster Semenya, who is an intersex runner from South Africa who identified as female. The initial hearing in her case put the burden on the IAAF to do exactly what the IAAF had initially done in the Pistorius case, that is, prove that some characteristic that they were citing was a major factor in success in the competition. That is currently where we are, and it separates the sex categories from basically every other category we're now dealing with in the regulation of sport. The issue on fairness is essentially that there is a relatively high correlation between certain levels of testosterone secretion and success in competition, but it's a contested one. Depending on how that gets resolved, it is likely that we will see more high secretors at the highest levels of sport. Is that a problem or not? That it depends, again, on what you think the purpose and social utility of the category is. The most recent set of claims have resonance, there is a resonance on the testosterone issues to doping. That is, although these are naturally occurring conditions, they are conditions that are like those matters which give athletes an advantage if taken exogenously. The newest set of challenges relate to persons who are transgender. That is, persons who developed as male and who then transition to be female. Should they be allowed to compete in the female category? Right now, we are in a scramble to develop rules. So in the United States, as I'm speaking to you, there is a great deal of concern about a swimmer at Penn who has already broken all of the women's intercollegiate and Ivy League records, and whether this woman, Leah Thomas, should be allowed to compete having transitioned. The current state of the rules is highly uncertain because the NCAA, the governing body for intercollegiate sport, has both said that it intends to defer to USA Swimming's definitions of who can compete, but it has delayed that till well after Leah Thomas would swim. The response to this particular set of problems has certain elements to it which don't entirely make sense. That is, anybody should be allowed to compete in the category that they believe themselves to be part of. That is largely a response to remove protections. What should take the place, how much persons should be allowed to shift their categories in response to genuine identity concerns is still very much contested and will be litigated. And what I think will be critical to making this effectively part of a functioning regime is either the recognition that the category itself in the current environment is unsustainable, that we don't, in fact, have enough shared views over who ought to be considered a woman, that it makes sense any longer to have this category, and we should simply have open competitions. Or alternatively, it would be a situation in which we develop highly accepted definitions, easy to identify, quickly able to be determined, which will be good enough. The good enough standard may not work whenever we have highly contested categories. So, in conclusion, what we have seen is categories have huge distributional effects. The response to those distributional effects by sporting bodies is to try to write rules that cannot effectively be challenged. It is a strategy which will work only to the degree that the entire governing of the sport is legally and socially accepted. So that's my comments. I'm happy to take questions from anyone who's interested in any of these issues.
Thank you, Paul. Some great insights there. I'll just unmute myself. There's already some questions coming in, I see. Some fascinating insights and certainly some really live issues, particularly the NCAA challenges that are being faced now. that you mentioned, particularly in swimming. And from a governance perspective, certainly it is really at the forefront of national sport federations and even international federations on this really striking a balance. And you use the word fairness quite a lot as well, striking a balance between fair competition and also protecting and being fair to those individuals and promoting inclusivity. So I suppose there's no right answer, but would be interested on your comments on how do we strike that balance correctly? Is it a question of governance? Is it a question of stakeholder consultation and engagement? Is it a question of science, as is often been the case in the transgender debate? Also, one of the common threads in the earlier part of your talk was about fairness of a different kind, and it's a fairness that I like to sort of delve into from an anti-doping perspective in my writing, and that is procedural fairness, or what you would call due process. And you mentioned a number of times that the burden of proof has not been met in the context of prosthetics, and the burden of proof is very difficult to meet in the context of anti-doping for athletes. So I suppose, putting it back to you, what is the system currently fair from a procedural perspective? We focus in our debate mostly on the substantive issues and the rights of athletes outside of the procedures in proving or disproving their eligibility or whether they can be included. But really, are we debating and discussing the due process element enough as well? So those are two kind of comments/questions from my point of view. There are a number more on the Q&A that are trickling in. I don't know if you wanted to tackle those first, or if we should.
I'm at your disposal. Would it be better to get a number in, or I'm perfectly happy? Those were excellent points that you made.
We'll start with them then, perhaps, because the others have a very different tangent, I think.
Okay, so science at least could narrow the disputes, but I think these are ultimately not scientific questions. That basically we can establish that although there is a continuum in certain spaces, there are discontinuities that make it appropriate to treat different people differently. I think in the case, again, of you specifically talked about anti-doping, there have been fairly remarkable developments in the science of detection, the ways in which we can work out exactly what's in bodies. What is much less clear is how effectively and how realistically it would be to work out the categories of things that should be regulated, and particularly the exceptional categories under the therapeutic use exceptions. So science has the potential to narrow the scope of dispute, but the ultimate questions are really political questions about who in the society we want to favor or disfavor, what the nature of the competition ought to be. On process of procedural rights, one of the things that I'm struck by is how increasingly on these eligibility matters, the process rights are hollow, because the kinds of things that the athletes would want to contest are simply taken off the table.
Thanks for those comments. And it strikes me also that, procedural, the burden of proof that you mentioned is much harder to meet, for example, for an athlete from a rural, remote village in India, as it would be to a professional athlete in American football, for example. So there's this strong lack of harmonization when it comes to fairness of athletes, although we're pushing uniform rules to all of these athletes.
And exactly to your point, virtually all the therapeutic use exceptions have been granted to athletes from the United Kingdom, the United States, and a couple of other, probably Australia, I don't know on that. That is a procedural fairness issue. Athletes in other parts of the world simply don't have access to the kind of medical support that would permit them to make out their therapeutic use exception.
So much, Paul. There's a whole heap of questions coming in, and I'll take a few of them. One from Keshab. Thank you for the lecture. I just wanted to know how important the role of affirmative action and quota systems are in promoting inclusion in sport.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first one there. And sort of on a related note, Akash has asked, could you highlight on the current Black coach hiring issues that are going on in the NFL, and what solution could be to provide Black coaches more fair opportunities to compete?
Okay, on the first question, again, in my undistinguished athletic career, I was very much the beneficiary of affirmative action for small people. So weight classes are a kind of affirmative action. If we are talking about affirmative action for minorities, this is not something that has been significantly part of a lot of the eligibility issues in sport. Where it's come up in certain jurisdictions is affirmative action for women. That is the creation and protection and financial support of women's competitions. So I think that's a place. On the attempt to increase inclusion in coaching hires, I think we should understand the lawsuit that was filed as a piece of political theater designed to shift the debate within the United States. The claims that are made are not in any conventional sense easily recognizable legal claims under the American legal system. What they are doing, however, is effectively shifting the debate. And if I can stick this idea in, we have seen a dramatic case of political theater shifting the governance of sport in American collegiate athletics. For over a century, almost a century and a quarter, the notion that college athletes should not be paid was simply enshrined in American consciousness and attitude. A number of lawsuits succeeded not in changing the rules, but in changing public attitudes. And with the change in public attitudes, you got a massive change in the rules. So as a result of the Supreme Court's decision and the actions by legislatures in about just under half of the American states, it is now possible for athletes to market themselves, their name, image, and likeness, and they cannot be deemed ineligible as a result of doing that. in order to effectuate that, they have to be able to get legal representation, which they could only get if they could pay for it prior to these decisions. They now are entitled to in connection with their attempts to market themselves and engage in that kind of activity. So the governance possibilities are shifting dramatically in response to effective pressure. In the case of the coaches, it's fairly striking that the initial response of the NFL was to say these claims have no legal merit, which I think is essentially true. And the second 3-day later response of the commissioner of the NFL was, this is a very serious problem, we have to address it. How would it be addressed? It would, I think, at the first stage, involve putting people into the decision rooms to ensure that certain kinds of things are taken off the table or put on the table, or alternatively, that you would have a centrally directed shift in the incentives for individual hiring units, since it's not the NFL who hires coaches, it's each of the team owners, to shift the incentives by giving rewards for people who meet the collective social goal of higher levels of inclusion.
Thanks, Paul. I'm conscious of time as well. And I mean, there are some really interesting questions that are still there, including the Djokovic case and whether the not willing to take a vaccine is an exclusion in its own right, and to what end public health concerns sort of override their interests. Can you talk on that for maybe a minute or so, and then we might wind up?
Okay, again, we've got two political claims. The one political claim is the claim to have autonomy over your body, and the other is a social claim. You have no right to endanger other people, and we're going to require an easy, relatively effective way of protecting the people of Australia from your potential dangers. We are currently seeing it in the NBA with those players who refuse to become vaccinated and thereby violate the laws of the state of New York and the ordinances of the city of New York, the ordinances of the city of San Francisco, but are permitted to compete in other parts of the United States. So do I have any particularly brilliant insights? I tend to have a much higher level of interest in collective goals. And so I would tend to be relatively sympathetic to Australia's claims. Whether, in fact, we've got problems in that particular instance with the application and the consistency with which the government acted, I think is a completely different matter. You probably know.
Again, competing interests. No, it's the wee hours of the morning here in Australia. So I don't know if I'm willing to debate such a hot topic at this point in time. But no, it's some really good insights there, and I want to thank you. And I'll hand over to my colleague Simran to deliver the vote of thanks, and then we might go to Oleg to convene the next phase of the session to talk to your colleagues about Duke and the opportunities that our students and others have to pursue degrees and hear more of your lectures and your colleagues' lectures as well. So thank you again. Over to Simran.
Thank you, Professor Starr. I would like to begin by thanking Professor Paul for a very, very insightful and a very, very engrossing lecture. I do not remember the last time I took such detailed notes, but thank you so much. There is, of course, a lot to think about the technicalities that often regulate and limit who can be a competitor in sports. So thank you so much for that. I would also like to thank Mr. Nathani, without whom it would be very difficult to organize this public lecture. So thank you, sir. I would also like to express our greatest and the most sincere gratitude and thanks to Professor C. Rajkumar, Professor Sahani, and Professor Sean Starr for their support and guidance, without which these conversations would be very, very difficult to organize in these difficult times of a pandemic. And also to Professor Starr for being up in the wee hours of the Australian next day. So thank you so much for that, sir. We would also be remiss if we do not acknowledge the importance of the institutional support that we've gotten from the Jindal Global University, Jindal Global Law School, and the Duke University, without which these academic conversations and collaborations would be very difficult to facilitate. And finally, I would like to thank the Center for Sports Law, Business and Governance, as well as the IT team of JGU for helping us override the challenges that holding a lecture in an online mode comes with. Thank you so much also to everyone who's joined in, and we look forward to the conversations with all of you in the next part of this session. Thank you.
So much, Simran. We might now hand over to Oleg for the next phase of discussions.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Professor Starr, and thank you, Professor Hagen, and folks at Jindal University for hosting us. I myself learned a tremendous amount and really appreciate the opportunity to engage with you, your students, and your faculty on this topic. This part of the program is meant to be really a dialogue, a pretty informal conversation. And what I wanted to talk to folks on the call about, the students especially, is really our international LLM program. And really offer myself and my colleagues in the International Studies Office. I see that Jabrina Robinson's already on the call. I think there are others as well, as a resource. I don't want, I know you've been hearing from Professor Hagen and others for a number of minutes now, and so I don't want to take up too much of your time. But I wanted to spend maybe 5-7 minutes talking about the LLM program, and then offer to answer any questions that you may have, and you can ask those via chat, or you can submit them directly to me in my email. You have my email address. I think if you can just Google Duke Law Oleg Kobylev, there's only one Oleg Kobylev at Duke Law School, so it should be pretty easy to find. So basically, just to give you a sense of what our international LM program is like, is that we think of it as kind of the right size and the right place program. When it comes to top tier American law schools, there are roughly two camps. There are schools typically located in large American cities that have large LLM programs, starting at 150 to 300, sometimes as many as 500 LLM students. And then there are programs that are in, kind of quintessential American college towns that have programs that are quite small, typically 20 to 50 students. Duke is unusual and I think somewhat distinctive in that our program sits somewhere in the middle. It usually enrolls between 80 and 90 students most years, sometimes 95, sometimes 70. And the reason we do that is intentional. The goal of the LLM at Duke Law School is to bring a class that is diverse and large enough to create intellectual engagement, both across the LLMs and with our American JD students, in a way and in a setting that is conducive to, intellectual inquiry and progress toward professional growth. And it is difficult to accomplish that in our experience in a class that is either too big or too small. At least that's what we think. Our class tends to be very diverse. Usually out of 85, 95 students, there will be 45 to 50 countries represented. And it is diverse not just in terms of geography, but also in terms of the professional experience and background of students that come to the LLM. I think there is a misperception that I hear sometimes from potential applicants that to get into a top tier LLM program, you need to be a certain profile. You need to have a certain profile when it comes to your professional credentials, that you need to have certain number of years of experience, or you need to be doing a sort of a particular type of thing or focus on a particular type of law. And at least for Duke, that is not true. We're really looking for the best and the brightest. And we're looking for folks who have shown through their professional and academic experience that they have what it takes to succeed in a top tier American program. And so we have folks who have not much in the way of experience. Maybe they just graduate from a top school like Jindal or University of Singapore or Cambridge, and folks who are partners and sometimes judges and prosecutors much later in their career. So it really runs the spectrum. And again, that is intentional because it creates a more enriching academic environment and intellectual environment in the classes. And as you have heard Professor Hagen, Professor Hagen is a great example of a professor who engages with his classes on a daily basis. He and all of our faculty, teach through the method of Socratic dialogue, where students are really expected to participate. And the richness of academic experience is driven by diversity of perspectives. And so we are certainly seeking that in our LLM students. So that's why we think that LLM at Duke is the right size. Why is it the right place? Well, just like the size, I think there is, a distinctive aspect to the Duke LLM, because we are not in a big city, but we are also not in a small college town. We're somewhere in the middle. Durham is an interesting place, and the part of the United States that we are, I think, is an interesting place. It is a thriving metropolitan area, often called the Research Triangle, and that has a lot of industry, a lot of top educational facilities here. In addition to Duke, there are two other major universities. And it is well recognized as one of the best places to live in the United States. That said, it is not a big city like New York or San Francisco. And so the quality of life and I think the cost of living here are significantly lower. So many people would say that the reason this area is attractive to both students and folks who move in from other parts of the United States is because of that combination of sort of world-class amenities, facilities, airport, restaurant, theater, just schools, all the great things that come with a sort of a thriving, economically prosperous area, but without the costs that usually are imposed by being in a major city, both in terms of living hassle and expense. Now, that's not to say that this area is perfect, because nothing is, but it certainly is an attractive place to be, and often is one of the most attractive places to move to in the United States. It is also incredibly diverse. As I was speaking with my colleagues from Jindal earlier before the seminar started, you know, a nearby town, Morrisville, for example, is known for its cricket fields. And we have, you know, an incredibly diverse population of folks from all over the world here, including Southeast Asia and, you know, all other parts of the world that are attracted to sort of the vibrant economy that we have here. And so there's a third distinction, and I will end there. And this is, I think, the more subjective one, I would say, but it's, you know, based on the many years of our students telling us about what they found to be particularly appealing to them in both the LLM program and sort of the general culture of the law school. And that is that, you know, Duke is generally known as a friendly place, a place where students are valued as individuals, and that students are supported in a very personalized way. And I think that is true for both of our JD and our LLM students. And it is, again, function, I think, of the combination of the size of the school as a whole. It's not a very large institution, but not too small, but also its location and just the general culture of our wonderful faculty, who I think genuinely enjoy the opportunity to interact with students, both JD and LLM, on a daily basis. And so we really are proud of the program that we have here. And our alumni tell us frequently that the reason they find the LLM at Duke to be especially rewarding to them, you know, much later in their career, is this sort of personal approach, size of the program, and the location. Those are, I think, the three key kind of distinctions of the program. I encourage those of you who are thinking about doing an LLM in the United States to check out our website and to listen especially to the testimonials of our students. I think students are often the best representatives and the best ambassadors for the program, especially when it comes to sort of day-to-day student experience. And we have lots of videos there featuring those students. And I also encourage you to reach out to me and my colleagues if you have specific questions. With that, I will stop. And if folks have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, I wish all of you, the best in your academic endeavors for the students. And again, really appreciative of all of my colleagues here on the call for their time and expertise.
Thank you so much, Oleg, for that. We do have one question from someone in the audience. It's from Chaitanya, and he's saying that considering it was told to us that JD students have the same classes as LLM students, what would you recommend, especially for a student who might want to reside and practice in the US eventually?
That's a really great question. And, you know, instead of me answering, I would actually, I think I'm going to ask one of our current students or recent graduates, I think now, Anushri Maskara, who has joined us on the call, to maybe see if she would address that question. Anushri, do you feel like you could address it?
Most certainly. Thank you, Oleg, for this opportunity to share my experience and my opinion. Hi, Chaitanya. I can totally relate to your question because before moving to the US, even I had this thought that, you know, I want to practice in the US and whether I should go for a JD program or for an LLM. But I started with an LLM and I found Duke to be a very optimal place. Duke provides you that opportunity to, you know, if you start with an LLM program, you can move to JD if you eventually want to practice in US. But I would like to say that not doing a JD that would not prevent you from practicing in US. And I can say that because I did an LLM, I graduated in December, and fortunately I secured a job in Clifford Chance, and I would be starting next month. So it's all about how you utilize your resources that Duke provides you throughout those nine months period. And I think if you employ all the resources that you have, all the connections that you build over the period, you will be able to secure a job in the US. And once you complete your LLM, you can obviously take the bar exam. And once you qualify the bar exam, you will be able to practice in the US as long as you want to. But then again, if you really want to go ahead with making a more strong base as to practicing in the US, if you don't secure a job during your LLM program, you can shift to JD, and Duke provides you that opportunity. So once you're in the JD program, then you are treated as a regular JD student, and you have much broader opportunities as compared to an LLM student. But LLM does not deprive you from practicing in the US. It does provide you a very strong foothold. And considering that you are an international student, you bring with yourself that international base, that Indian culture with yourself in the law firm. So you have you stand at a different standpoint as compared to a JD student, and that is duly respected by the law firms. So as an LLM student, you can certainly go ahead and work permanently in the US if you want to, provided you employ all the resources, you secure a job, and nothing is stopping you from getting a job if you're an LLM student.
Thank you so much, Anushri. That was perfect. And it's exactly what we we work closely with our students in the LLM program and JD programs to provide them with one-on-one counseling and support to help them realize their professional goals and give them the market intelligence and the tools they need to be successful. And it really is a multi-step process that starts, sometimes, in fact, often well before you even come to Duke, with the information that you will receive from Jabrina Robinson, who's here on our call. She takes the lead on career advising to our LLM students, and she works with many of our JD students as well. And it really is a process, an iterative process that happens all through the year to get students to a point where they can really leverage all that they have accomplished, not just at Duke, but before, to vault themselves, to use Professor Hagen's earlier example, into the market of their choice, be it either in the United States or elsewhere in the world. Jabrina, I don't know if you have anything you'd want to add, to this.
I was just going to add briefly that there's not one set formula that's really out there for foreign trained lawyers to kind of land that perfect job in the US. It's a very personalized journey and a personalized process. And here at Duke Law, we really try to have a full curriculum of resources and services to help you understand the US legal market, as well as to do personal reflection and assessment to figure out where you will be most marketable in the US legal market. And then we try to help you to bridge and build that network to navigate acquiring a job here. And again, kind of as Oleg and Anushri said, we really kind of focus on this one-on-one personalized coaching to kind of help our students to achieve whatever their goals are. We have LLMs that want to return to their home countries. We have LLMs who want to work here in the US. It's just very distinct, different processes. And really, as you're looking at schools, trying to make sure that you have a school that will support you navigate your personal journey.
Thank you so much. Simran, any other questions?
We don't have any other questions for the time being, but I'm sure that a lot of our students would be reaching out to you guys. 2 years before, I would have been reaching out to you guys. So thank you so much for this. And congratulations, Anushri, on not only graduating with a very well-renowned LLM, but also landing a job. So good. Thank you so much, Jabrina. I know the work you do is not easy. So thank you so much for that. And thank you, Oleg, for introducing us to Duke. We all know what the degree, the diploma you get holds. But I think often we forget that completing an LLM is as much a social experience as it is an academic endeavor. And I think this insight into Duke makes it, of course, seem like a very, very welcoming place. And so I'm sure we're going to get a lot of queries on our end and on yours. And thank you so much for this. Thank you so much, Professor Paul, for still being around and for this very interesting lecture. Thank you, everyone. Good evening.
Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.